Hey guys, welcome. I know the day has been long and the world might feel a little overwhelming right now. So let's take a deep breath together. Inhale slowly and exhale. Let everything go. Imagine yourself wrapped in warmth, safe from the chaos of the day. Close your eyes, let your body relax, and let's ease into tonight's journey. Now, I want you to imagine a night so cold that your breath freezes before it even reaches the air. The sharp, biting chill of winter wraps itself around you like an iron fist, gripping every inch of your body, seeping into your bones. It's the kind of cold that makes your skin tingle with frostbite's cruel kiss, and every exhale forms little icicles that hang like ornaments in the dark. And this isn't some mild, uncomfortable winter night. No, this is the kind of cold that cuts straight through your layers of rough wool, through your cloak, through your very soul, and still leaves you trembling. For the medieval peasant, winter was more than just a season. It was a battle for survival. When the world outside froze over, everything they knew about life, comfort, and even basic existence was challenged. Winter wasn't something you could just endure with a few layers of clothing and a warm drink by the fire. It was an all-out war, every single year, where losing wasn't an option, but surviving was a daily fight. When the first frost appeared, it was a signal that life as they knew it was about to become more uncertain. The crops they had spent the warmer months planting and tending to were gone, stored in barns that were far from secure. The food that had been carefully preserved now faced the risk of spoilage or the gnawing hunger that came from an empty pantry. Livestock, the animals they depended on for milk, eggs, and meat, were brought inside to share the cramped space of the home, turning it into a mix of human and animal warmth. There was no such thing as personal space. The fire in the hearth became the sole source of warmth, and if that fire went out, well, then the cold would creep in like an unwanted guest, relentless and unforgiving. So, before we get cozy under our plush blankets, sipping our hot drinks, and turning up the thermostat, let's take a moment to step back in time. Imagine a night where comfort didn't mean being wrapped in soft, heated blankets or adjusting the room temperature with a tap of a finger. Comfort meant surviving a night without freezing to death. There were no central heating systems keeping rooms toasty. No heated blankets that felt like a gentle hug as you drifted off to sleep. No thermostat to reach for when the chill of the night air began to creep in. Instead, the cold was everywhere, seeping in through cracks in the walls, blowing in through holes in the roof, chilling the stone floors and the very air you breathed. It was raw. It was bone-chilling. It was a constant reminder of how fragile human existence truly is. Imagine sleeping on a bed made of straw, perhaps with a few rags or hay to cushion your body from the cold ground beneath you. You layer your rough wool tunics, your cloak, and any scrap of fabric you can find. Still, sleep is elusive as the cold creeps in, snaking its way through every inch of your being. There's no instant heat from a push of a button, no furnace running in the background. There's just you, the fire, and the thin walls of your home, with the wind howling relentlessly outside. And if the fire goes out in the night, well, it's a race against time to rekindle it, a desperate scramble for warmth before the cold becomes too much to bear. Now you might be thinking, what on earth does this have to do with me? Well, let's put it this way. Next time you complain about the cold air coming through a crack in the window, or how hard it is to keep the house warm, just remember that medieval peasants didn't have draft-proof windows, and their homes were more like wind tunnels than anything else. For them, keeping the fire burning wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was the difference between life and death. And as we're diving into this chilly, frost-bitten world, let me quickly remind you, if you like what you're about to hear, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I promise you, I'll keep the stories coming. Also, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from. How cold is it where you are? Trust me, I always find it fascinating to see who's joining me from across the globe. Okay, now let's get back to those peasants. Imagine yourself in their shoes, huddled inside a rickety hut made of sticks, mud, and whatever scrap materials you could find. The wind outside howls like an angry ghost, pushing through every crack in the walls. Your only defense against the elements is a flickering fire that's just barely keeping the cold at bay. The walls, if you could even call them walls, are thin and weak, barely keeping the worst of the winter outside. Inside, you're sharing the space with your family, your livestock, and the smell of wet wool. Yes, your animals are indoors too. More on that later. But for now, let's just say there's not a lot of room to stretch out. And you know what's worse? It's not just the temperature, it's the danger. That night, your toes could freeze off before morning. Frostbite doesn't wait for spring. It doesn't care if you're prepared or not. You might wake up tomorrow and find that your feet are beyond saving, or worse, you never wake up at all. The cold isn't just an inconvenience, it's a real threat. You have to fight it with everything you've got, and your everything is usually just layers of rough wool, animal skins, and a stubborn refusal to give up. But let's rewind a bit and set the stage. Picture it. You're living in a small, one-room home made of whatever you could gather: mud, sticks, straw, and maybe some dung for insulation. Yes, I said dung. It's not a mansion by any stretch of the imagination. It's barely even a shelter. It's a survival pod. You're lucky if the roof stays intact after a snowstorm, and you're definitely not winning any awards for interior design. It's cold, it's uncomfortable, and every night is a struggle to see if you'll make it through until morning. There's no easy way to say it. Being a medieval peasant in winter was brutal. It was an existence marked by constant hardship, where the simplest comforts of modern life were nothing but dreams that they could never quite reach. The things we take for granted today, like central heating, warm blankets, and even something as simple as a hot cup of tea, were luxuries that peasants could only fantasize about. Imagine waking up in the dead of winter, your home barely above freezing, and realizing you have no way of escaping the cold. No quick fix, no cozy retreat to a heated room. But here's the thing, they did survive. Somehow, some way, these medieval peasants made it through some of the coldest, harshest winters in history. They didn't have modern technology or the comforts of a warm home. They didn't have electric blankets or space heaters. They didn't even have warm clothes that fit properly. What they had was pure grit, creativity, and an unbreakable will to live. They found ways to endure, to adapt, and to fight back against nature's harshest elements. How? Well, that's what we're about to dive into. We're going to explore the ways they used every resource at their disposal to make it through the long, brutal winter nights. From clever insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies, their ingenuity and survival instincts were their greatest allies. But while we can admire their ingenuity, there was no escaping the brutal reality of what it was like to live through such freezing winters. Now, let's step inside the medieval homes, where the fight against the cold began long before the first frostbite hit. So, get comfortable, because the medieval peasant survival guide is about to begin. But first, if you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more. And again, let me know in the comments, how are you keeping warm these days? Got any fun winter survival tips to share? Or is your biggest problem a chilly draft by the window? Let's keep the conversation going. Trust me, it's fascinating to see how far we've come from these tough times. Let's take a moment to imagine what it was like to live in a typical medieval peasant home. And by home, I mean a space that could barely keep out the elements, let alone provide any semblance of comfort. The medieval peasant didn't have the luxury of central heating, double-glazed windows, or even something as simple as a sturdy, wind-resistant door. No, they had something far more charming, a drafty, cold, and often falling apart shack made from whatever materials they could gather, and I mean whatever. Picture this, a tiny, single-room hut, the size of a small living room by today's standards. But here's the catch. Everything in this room was meant to serve multiple functions. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a kitchen, a living room, a dining room, and a bathroom. Well, kind of. If you were a lucky peasant, maybe you had a small loft or a sleeping platform to sleep on, if you could call it that. If you weren't lucky, the floor was your bed, a pile of hay or straw that barely kept the cold from the earth at bay. Maybe you had a blanket, maybe not. And yes, you were probably sharing that with a few fleas, rats, or a hungry dog. Let's start with the walls. Now, when I say walls, I use the term loosely. The average medieval peasant hut was constructed from sticks, mud, straw, and occasionally animal dung. Yes, you heard that right. Dung. The walls were plastered with a mix of mud, straw, and whatever animal droppings were available, which surprisingly acted as a sort of insulator. The idea was to make sure the cold didn't just come rushing in like an uninvited guest. It wasn't exactly luxury insulation. It was more like throwing mud and poop at your house and hoping for the best. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Barely. And then there's the roof. Oh, the roof. Imagine it. A thatched affair, meant to keep the rain and snow out. But after a few months of harsh weather, it started sagging and leaking. A roof that doubles as a home for squirrels? Welcome to medieval luxury. Don't worry about attic insulation, though, because medieval peasants didn't even have attic space. Instead, your roof acted like a giant sieve for snow and rain, allowing whatever the weather gods threw at it to come tumbling in right into your lap. Nothing says cozy like getting rained on while you're sleeping, right? But it wasn't just the roof that let in the weather. The walls had gaps you could drive a cart through, and the wind didn't hesitate to come right on in. These homes were basically open-air shelters with walls and a roof to kind of protect you from the elements, but only when the weather was at its best. When it was bad, well, there was no escaping it. The cold crept in through every crack, every gap. Imagine sitting by the fire, trying to stay warm, and then feeling a cold gust sweep across your back because the animal skins hanging by the doorway decided to flap in the wind. You'd pull your cloak tighter, but let's be honest, it wasn't really going to help. Now, don't forget that these homes weren't just shared by humans. Oh no, the animals had their place too. That's right, medieval peasants brought their livestock indoors. It was a matter of survival. The cows, chickens and pigs were tucked in for the night to provide warmth. You might think your dog hogging the bed is bad. Imagine trying to sleep next to a stubborn goat who insisted on sitting right at the foot of your bed. It's like a warm body pillow, except it smells like, well, goat. And pigs? They didn't care where they plopped down. So, you could find yourself curled up next to a pig in your tiny, crowded hut. It wasn't glamorous, but at least you weren't freezing to death. If you weren't sleeping with livestock, you were likely sleeping next to a fire. Now, this fire wasn't your cozy modern fireplace that you can enjoy from a safe distance. No, this was a small pit in the center of your room, maybe surrounded by a few stones, with smoke wafting up through tiny holes in the roof. Sure, you had a fire to cook your meals and keep warm, but you also had smoke drifting into your lungs all night. And forget about cleaning that chimney. Most peasant huts didn't even have one. The smoke would fill the room, and as it swirled around, it did a great job of fumigating the fleas, but it didn't do much for the air quality. The fire was your best friend in the winter, but it was also your worst enemy. It was either too hot or not hot enough. And if you were unlucky enough to be sitting on the wrong side of the room, you might as well have been outside with the sheep, huddled in a pile of straw. Let's talk about windows. Yes, windows, if you were fortunate enough to have one. The windows were laughably small, and made of thin animal skin or wood shutters, because glass was far too expensive for peasants. And those little holes were supposed to let in light and allow you to see the world outside, but most days you probably weren't seeing much of anything, except maybe the occasional squirrel scurrying across your thatched roof. The wind, however, didn't care about your little patch of skin covering the window. It would whip through those tiny gaps cutting through your layers of wool like a knife through butter. You could try to plug up the cracks with rags or moss, but it was always a losing battle. The floors weren't much better either. In fact, calling it a floor might be a bit of a stretch. Instead of smooth planks or stone, medieval peasant homes typically had a foundation made of packed dirt. And while this might sound a bit rustic, it was actually just the beginning of your indoor discomfort. The dirt floor, while practical for the time, didn't exactly offer any protection from the elements. When the rains came, or worse, when the snow melted in the spring, the ground itself would start to turn into a soggy, muddy mess. If you were unlucky enough to be living in one of these homes during a particularly wet season, congratulations. You didn't just get a floor, you got an indoor water feature. The water would seep through the ground, creeping up like a silent invader, making every step feel like you were walking through a swamp. The once dry earth beneath your feet would become a muddy morass that wouldn't go away until the weather decided to cooperate, whenever that was. But let's say you weren't cursed with water flooding your home every time it rained. Maybe you decided to throw down a bit of straw to cushion your step and create a semblance of comfort. Well, don't get too excited, because the straw wasn't long for this world either. Within a matter of days or weeks, the straw would quickly flatten underfoot, losing any semblance of softness. What you'd be left with was a thick, wet, and increasingly foul-smelling mat that was far more soggy swamp than sleeping cushion. And, oh, did it come with perks. After a while, the moisture in the air mixed with the mouldy straw, creating the perfect breeding ground for bugs, critters, and all sorts of delightful companions. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, you name it, they loved living in the straw. And guess what? These roommates were not the polite, quiet kind who would at least stay out of sight. No, they were active, constantly scurrying around, biting and making their presence known. They were essentially part of your family now, contributing to the lovely ambience of your home. And it wasn't just the insects. Oh no, the straw would also attract rodents, like mice and rats, who found the cozy bedding to be a perfect place to make their nests. If you thought your hay-filled bed was bad for your comfort, it was even worse for your hygiene. Those little critters weren't shy about leaving their mark, making your mattress a living, moving ecosystem of bacteria, urine, and other less than pleasant surprises. So, as you tried to get some sleep at night, you would be sharing your space with the smells, sounds, and movements of creatures that were all too eager to make themselves at home in your already uncomfortable sleeping quarters. If you were lucky, you could at least try to ignore the scratching and scurrying sounds, if you weren't too preoccupied with the fleas crawling all over your skin. But hey, at least they kept you company, right? In a world where personal space was a luxury and privacy was a distant dream, having a lively bunch of critters around might have made you feel just a bit less alone. However, the reality was that this constant invasion from the animal kingdom didn't exactly foster an environment conducive to good health or peaceful sleep. So, when people talk about the hardships of medieval life, they often mention the cold and the lack of food. But the truth is, the floors of those homes were like a never-ending reminder that comfort was for the privileged, not the peasants. Whether it was a flood of mud beneath your feet, or an infestation of insects crawling over your straw bed, it was a constant battle to maintain any kind of basic hygiene or sense of comfort. And this was just one of the many ways medieval peasants had to adapt to a life full of discomfort, survival, and, frankly, a lot of pests. Let's just say that the luxury of a medieval peasant's floor was something best left to the imagination and not something any of us would envy. And remember, there's no such thing as personal space. The whole family would sleep together in that cramped, cold room, probably with a few animals thrown in for good measure. Picture this: kids wedged between parents, grandpa tucked into the corner, maybe a couple of chickens pecking around the floor, and a goat snoring at your feet. Privacy? That was as mythical as a warm, peaceful night's sleep. The goal wasn't to sleep comfortably. It was to survive until morning without freezing solid. Your bed might have been a pile of hay or straw, but it was a bed you shared with the whole family. And if you were lucky, you got to sleep near the fire, where the warmth was just a little bit stronger. If you were unlucky, you were stuck on the edge of the room, right by the drafty door, where the cold bit harder. So, if you think your modern apartment is drafty because the window doesn't quite shut right, or your heater is a little too temperamental, medieval peasants would like to have a word. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were like wind tunnels with roofs. If you wanted to be warm, you had to fight for it, and sometimes even the fight wasn't enough. Despite the cold draftiness and cramped conditions, peasants had no choice but to get creative in their quest for warmth. Let's take a closer look at how they crafted makeshift insulation using whatever they had at hand. And sometimes, that meant getting a little smelly. When you think about insulation today, you probably imagine modern materials like fiberglass or spray foam, things that keep your house warm and cozy with minimal effort. But medieval peasants, well, let's just say their idea of insulation didn't come with a friendly contractor or a roll of fancy material from the hardware store. No, medieval peasants had to get a bit more creative, and by creative, I mean resourceful, stubborn, and often a little smelly. The goal was simple: stay warm enough to survive the night. The tools at their disposal? Well, let's dive in. Imagine this. You're huddling in your tiny cold hut with your family and your livestock, and you know that night is going to be rough. The wind is howling outside, and your little fire in the hearth isn't enough to combat the icy air creeping through every crack in the walls. What do? You get creative. And by creative, I mean using every single thing at your disposal to try and keep the cold at bay. The first line of defense? Straw. Now, straw might sound like a fun and harmless material. A few dried stalks of grass you could easily sweep away with a broom. But in medieval times, straw was a peasant's best friend when it came to insulation. It wasn't just for making a quick snack for the cows or laying underfoot for the horses. No, straw was a strategic tool in the battle against the bone-chilling cold that would sweep through your hut every winter. You'd lay it down on the floor like a patchwork rug, pile it up against the walls to fill the gaps where the cold air could slip through, and even use it in the roof, stuffed between the thatch to help keep out the frost. It wasn't just bedding, it was an essential piece of the survival puzzle, a last-ditch effort to create a tiny barrier between you and the elements. The idea was simple. Layering straw would trap pockets of warm air, much like how we imagine modern insulation working today. Straw was light, flexible, and widely available, making it the perfect material for insulating your living space in a pinch. And while it certainly wasn't glamorous, it did its job. The warmth from the fire in the hearth would rise and get trapped in the thick layers of straw, providing some much-needed comfort through the night. But, and here's the kicker, it wasn't exactly a luxury option. It wasn't going to keep you warm like a fancy down comforter. It wasn't going to wrap you in the kind of soft, cozy warmth we're used to today. No, this was bare-bones survival at its finest, and the straw itself often came with a list of disadvantages that you wouldn't find in your average modern home. For one thing, straw didn't hold up forever. It was an organic material, and like all things organic, it eventually broke down. Over time, as the weight of your body, your family, and any animals that might share your bed compressed it, the straw would flatten. Instead of providing the cushion and warmth you were hoping for, it would become a soggy mess, much like a poorly made mattress after months of use. And let's not forget the moisture. During rainy or snowy seasons, the moisture would seep in, making the straw not only uncomfortable, but a breeding ground for mold and fungus. These damp layers of straw would soak up any water that made its way into your home, and as a result, your once cozy bedding would quickly transform into a spongy, musty mess that not only lost its insulating properties, but also became a haven for insects. The other problem with straw, especially when it was used on the floor, was that it was never truly dry. Unless you had a bit of luck on your side and a roof that didn't leak too badly, there was always the risk of moisture creeping in from the outside, turning your straw into a wet, slushy disaster. But hey, at least it wasn't frozen, right? Sure, you might have been sleeping on a damp, mouldy, bug-infested mess, but it could have been worse. You could have been outside in the freezing cold without the luxury of straw. In a world where survival was a day-to-day challenge, the straw might have been far from ideal, but it was still your best bet for making it through the long, bitter winters. It wasn't just about warmth. It was about finding anything that could help you hold on for another day, another night. Straw may not have been perfect, but it sure beat the alternative. And just like that, you've survived the straw-filled, mouldy, flea-infested night. But don't get too comfortable, because things are about to get even more creative and a little stinky as we continue exploring the makeshift insulation tactics medieval peasants used to stay alive. Stay tuned, and don't forget to hit subscribe for more historical survival stories. Trust me, these peasants' tricks are about to make you appreciate your modern home just a little more. Next up in the peasants' arsenal of survival tools was moss. Yes, moss, the fluffy green stuff you might find growing on the north side of a tree or in damp, shady spots. For peasants, moss was a multifunctional item. It could be stuffed into the cracks in the walls to help block the wind, or jammed between the layers of straw and dung for an extra layer of insulation. Moss had that lovely ability to hold moisture, which in turn helped to keep it firm and compact. But unfortunately, it also helped to keep the mold nice and cozy. So, while moss may have seemed like a smart idea, it came with its own set of problems. It wasn't like the moss you find in your garden today, fresh and green. No, this moss had been around for a while and had developed a certain earthy fragrance. But wait, we haven't even gotten to the best part yet. The real medieval insulation solution came in the form of animal dung. Yes, you heard that right. Dung. You see, when you're a medieval peasant, you're not exactly working with the same resources as the nobility. And when you've got livestock on hand, you make the most of what you've got. Dung was used in two key ways: to coat the walls of your home and to stuff into cracks. The mix of mud, straw, and dung, the latter of course being the secret ingredient, created a sticky, insulating substance that could be applied to walls in thick layers. It didn't just hold things together, it helped keep the cold out. As you can imagine, that wasn't exactly a pleasant smell to live with. The scent of fresh manure mixed with the earthy aromas of wet straw and damp moss would likely have been memorable, to say the least. So, not only were you trapped in a tiny hut with your family and livestock, but you were now living in a home infused with the fragrance of dung. But hey, it worked. In theory, the dung-laden walls acted as a decent barrier against the cold. It wasn't going to win any interior design awards, but it did keep the heat in and the cold out. Plus, it was free, and when you're a peasant, free is the best kind of insulation. And then there were the animal hides. While most of the insulation efforts went into the structure of the house itself, when it came to staying warm while you slept, the solution was simple: layer up with whatever you had. If you were lucky enough to have a few spare animal hides, they could be draped over the walls, hung on doorways, or even layered over the roof for added protection against the cold. These hides weren't exactly plush or soft like the cozy blankets we use today. No, they were tough, rough, and still probably had the scent of the animal they came from, which, let's be real, wasn't exactly a pleasant aroma. Imagine wrapping yourself in a cowhide that had been tanned but still held on to that earthy barnyard scent. If the hide was from a freshly slaughtered animal, it might even still have a bit of grease or fat left on it, which, while useful in keeping the cold at bay, made it sticky and even more unpleasant to touch. But when you're stuck in a freezing, drafty house with no other options, you learn to appreciate whatever you could get your hands on. Cow hides, goat hides, sheep pelts, these were the typical options. They were thick and durable, and, while not exactly comfortable or warm by modern standards, they were your best bet for survival. And let's not forget about the smell. A wet, greasy cowhide in the dead of winter was probably a sensory experience you never forgot. It didn't exactly have the pleasant aroma of lavender or freshly baked cookies, but it did have one very important feature. It kept you alive. The hides acted as a barrier against the cold, trapping body heat and preventing it from escaping. You would layer these over you while sleeping, hoping that at least one layer would provide some semblance of warmth for the night. And sure, you could imagine the sticky feeling of a cold, heavy cowhide pressed against your skin, especially in the dead of winter, when your body would be stiff and chilled from the cold. But honestly, that was a lot better than the alternative, lying exposed to the harsh, bitter cold outside, where you might actually freeze to death before morning. And it wasn't just the hides that were used for warmth. Pelts could also be wrapped around the walls, acting like an additional layer of insulation. Hanging them over the doorways helped block drafts, and sometimes the hides would be placed over the roof to keep snow and cold air from leaking inside. So, while you might not have been cozy under a blanket, at least you were alive and had a slightly better chance of waking up in the morning. And if you were really lucky, you might even get to sleep under some furs. Furs were considered a luxury, even by peasant standards, so only the wealthier peasants might have access to them. But for those who did, furs were an essential part of surviving the winter. They didn't just look impressive, they actually helped trap warmth, keeping your body heat from escaping into the frigid air. Of course, the downside was that they weren't exactly easy to clean, and after a few months of use, they likely had their own scent as well. But once again, you didn't have the luxury of fine fabrics or plush comforters. You made do with what you had. So, in essence, medieval insulation wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. The techniques peasants used to keep the cold at bay were messy, uncomfortable, and often stinky, but they worked. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. You might have been sleeping on a bed of straw next to a pig, wrapped in a stinky cowhide, but at least you weren't frozen solid by morning. And when you think about it, isn't that kind of genius? But let's pause for a second. If you're starting to feel a bit grateful for your modern, insulated home, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. And if you're enjoying this journey into medieval survival, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more tales of peasant ingenuity. While you're at it, share your thoughts with me in the comments. What do you think? Could you survive a night in one of those dung and straw homes? Or would you be begging for central heating before you even got to bed? But as clever as these solutions were, nothing could shield peasants entirely from the unforgiving cold. The real enemy wasn't just the walls, but the elements outside that relentlessly worked to freeze them. Let's take a deep dive into the daily battle against the snow, wind, and ice that peasants faced. Imagine stepping outside into a world where the cold hits you like a wall of ice. A wind so bitter, it feels like it's cutting straight through your skin, piercing into your very bones. That's medieval winter for you, my friend. And if you think your drafts are bad today, just wait until you hear about how medieval peasants lived through the relentless winter elements. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a daily fight for survival. When you're living in a tiny, poorly insulated hut with walls that are more about wishful thinking than actual protection, winter was an invasive, unyielding force. The cold wasn't something that came and went. It was always there, inescapable. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls like a rabid dog, shrieking and gnawing at the very core of your resolve. There was no such thing as a cozy nook to curl up in and avoid the chill. The cold would find you, no matter where you tried to hide. Even if you huddled by the fire, the heat from the hearth would only reach so far. If you were on the wrong side of the room, it was like trying to camp outside in the middle of a snowstorm. The snow, oh, that was just a cherry on top. Picture this. The cold comes first, wrapping itself around everything like an iron fist. Then, the snow starts falling, silent, relentless, covering everything with a thick, suffocating blanket. It doesn't just make things cold, it makes them wet. And when you're already struggling to keep the cold out, wet is the last thing you want to deal with. Snow would seep into your home, drift under doorways, and pile up in the corners. And if you didn't keep up with shoveling, you'd find yourself living in a snow globe, but one where the only thing inside was a lot of frozen misery. And let's not even talk about what happens when you need to go out. There was no modern footwear to help you fight the snow, no waterproof boots or cozy woolen socks. Medieval peasants probably got up close and personal with the cold every time they stepped outside. Barefoot? You bet. Maybe you wrapped some rags around your feet and shoved them into wooden clogs, but those weren't exactly built for snow trekking. Imagine trying to trudge through knee-high snowdrifts with nothing but soggy rags and flimsy footwear. Every step you take feels like an act of defiance against nature itself. A gust of wind comes through, and you're instantly frostbitten, your fingers turning stiff and blue, your toes frozen like little ice blocks. Speaking of frostbite, medieval peasants had a real intimate relationship with it. It wasn't just something that happened to the unlucky few. No, when your body was exposed to the harsh conditions for hours on end, frostbite was practically an inevitability. It would creep up on you, starting with a little tingling sensation in your extremities. The hands, feet, ears, and nose, those were the first to go. Once the frostbite sets in, it's not just an uncomfortable feeling, it's a crippling one. The skin starts to harden, the tissue dying off, and suddenly, you've lost your fingers or toes, parts of you that are now too far gone to be useful. But that wasn't the worst part. No, hypothermia was lurking right around the corner, and hypothermia didn't care about your daily survival tactics. It would slowly shut down your body's ability to function, freezing you from the inside out. You'd start feeling numb, your body giving in to the cold, as if your own limbs were betraying you. Hypothermia was a silent killer, always there, just waiting for you to let your guard down. The cold's attack didn't just leave you with physical pain, it also took its toll mentally. Just imagine the sheer exhaustion of battling the elements day in and day out. It wasn't just a few hours of discomfort. The cold would wear you down over time. You'd wake up freezing in the morning, struggle to light the fire, if you even had enough dry wood, and then have to work through the day just to survive, all while trying to keep your hands from going numb. And if you had to work outside, well, that's where it gets real fun. You'd be exposed to the elements constantly, whether you were tending to your crops, feeding your livestock, or trying to make repairs to your hut. There was no escaping it. The cold would gnaw at your resolve, taking away every ounce of energy, until you felt like you were only going through the motions. You couldn't just throw on a down jacket and call it a day. There was no winter gear. It was just you, your family, and the animals you could cram into your home, all trying to survive together. And don't even get me started on the wind. The wind in the medieval world didn't just whisper through the cracks of your home. Oh no, it screeched and howled like a banshee, a sound so terrifying that it almost felt like the wind itself was alive, with a mind of its own, and a vendetta against anyone who dared to live in its path. It would come at you from all directions, as if plotting its assault. There were no safe corners in your humble little hut. It would tear through the thatch roof, slip under the door, and rush in through every gap in the walls, no matter how small. Those cracks you tried to ignore, well, the wind sure didn't. It found them, and it didn't care if it was just a tiny hole or the space between two wooden planks. If it was there, the wind would squeeze through, pushing the cold deeper into your bones. The wind didn't stop at the walls. It swept through your clothing, underneath your layers of wool tunics and cloaks, making sure nothing was safe. You could huddle close to the hearth, desperately leaning in toward the fire, and maybe even wrap yourself in every blanket you owned, but the wind would always find a way to sneak through the cracks in your defenses. It didn't care how tightly you bundled yourself up, or how carefully you positioned your body to catch the warmth. Nothing stopped it. It was a sneaky, invasive force, making the cold feel even worse. Like it wasn't just outside anymore, but wrapping itself around you, piercing through your body, and pushing deeper than you could ever expect. There was no escape from it. You couldn't just walk away, find shelter, and let it blow over. Medieval peasants had to live with that wind, constantly fighting it off in any way they could. Whether it was packing rags into gaps, huddling with family, or keeping the fire as close as possible, surviving the wind became part of daily life. And if you didn't win that battle, the cold wouldn't be your only enemy. Frostbite, hypothermia, those were the final blows, but the wind was the one that softened you up for the fight. It made your struggle with the elements feel endless, pushing you to the brink of exhaustion and forcing you to hold on for just a little longer. So, when you think about medieval winters, remember the wind. It was more than just a nuisance. It was a constant enemy in your home, a reminder that no matter how hard you tried to stay warm, nature was always right there, reminding you who was in charge. And that cold, biting wind, it didn't care about your plans. It didn't care if you'd stacked the firewood or layered on 5 woolen tunics. It was coming, and you had no choice but to survive it, no matter what it took. Now, hypothermia, that's where things got real dangerous. Once you started getting too cold, your body began to shut down, slowly at first, like it was trying to warn you. At first, you might notice your fingers and toes starting to feel a bit numb, almost like they're not quite your own. But then, the numbness spreads, and eventually, you stop feeling them altogether. It's like your body is slowly retreating into itself, trying to conserve whatever little heat it has left. Cold is no longer just something that makes you shiver. It's something that starts to take control, one part of your body at a time. Your muscles stiffen, and you might start to feel like you're walking through thick mud with every step, your body moving slower and slower. The wind, the snow, the damp. It all feels like it's not just outside anymore. It's inside, infiltrating your very cells. If you didn't act quickly, if you didn't find shelter or warmth, your body would lose the fight, and that was when things really started to get dangerous. As the cold seeps deeper into your bones, you begin to shiver uncontrollably, a violent shake that seems like it's trying to wring warmth out of you. You can feel your body working overtime, trying to keep itself alive, but the cold doesn't care. It doesn't stop for anyone, not even for the tired, freezing peasant. And the more you shiver, the weaker you become. Your breath becomes shallow, your thoughts clouded, and every movement feels like it's taking more effort than the last. Once you've crossed that line, you're in the danger zone. You're no longer just fighting against the weather. You're fighting against your own body, which is slowly succumbing to the icy grip of winter. The warmth you once had, the life inside you, starts to slip away, and you begin to feel detached from it all. You might even start to lose your coordination, your mind clouded by the cold, unsure if you're even able to get up and move anymore. Your senses start to dull. The feeling in your hands and feet is gone. You're no longer sure if you're shivering from the cold or from the loss of warmth altogether. At this point, it's not just about being cold anymore. It's about survival. The cold becomes your enemy, and it's an enemy that you can't escape without help. If you don't get warmth soon, real warmth, the chances of making it through the night grow slimmer. The longer the cold stays in control, the further away you are from waking up in the morning. In those medieval winters, even the hardiest peasants weren't immune to the dangers of hypothermia. They had to fight the cold, not just with their will, but with every trick and tactic they had in their survival handbook. And it didn't matter who you were, whether you were a young peasant, an old man, or a pregnant woman. The cold didn't care. You were all at risk. If you didn't find warmth, if you didn't have enough food, you wouldn't survive. Period. So, while we might complain about how chilly it gets when we forget to turn up the thermostat, or how inconvenient it is when our pipes freeze, take a moment to imagine living through medieval winter. No heaters, no thick blankets, no modern winter gear. Just you, your fire, your animals, and the biting cold that would do its best to steal your warmth and your life. The next time you feel a draft near your window, just remember, you've got it way easier than a medieval peasant. But hey, let's not focus too much on the discomfort. After all, these peasants had to deal with it every day, and they still found ways to survive. They got creative with their warmth, huddling close to one another, sharing body heat, and doing whatever they could to fend off the cold. So, don't forget to give them some credit for their resourcefulness and resilience. And while we're at it, don't forget to hit subscribe if you're enjoying the tale of survival through medieval winters. In the face of these harsh conditions, the fire became more than just a source of light. It was the last hope for survival. Let's explore how peasants relied on their hearths to battle the cold, and how keeping that fire alive was an art in itself. Ah, the hearth. In the medieval world, there was no such thing as life without it. The hearth wasn't just a source of warmth, it was the heart of the home, literally and figuratively. If you didn't have a hearth, you didn't have much of a home at all. No fire, no warmth, no chance of survival. And when winter came knocking, you realized pretty quickly that the fire was more than just a place to cook or light the room. It was life or death. Let's start with the basics. What even was a hearth in medieval times? Picture this: a bare-bones fire pit, maybe made of some basic stones, or a little brick if you were lucky. There were no fancy chimneys, no ventilation systems, just a small, often smoky pit in the centre of the room. A fire wasn't a clean, convenient affair. You'd have to keep it going, constantly feeding it with logs, kindling, or dried dung, and it would smoke up the place like an unintentional sauna. The chimney? Oh, you could forget about that. Most homes didn't have chimneys. Smoke drifted up through small holes in the roof or the gaps between the thatched roof and the walls, and sometimes you just had to sit there, coughing through the haze, praying the fire didn't snuff out while you tried to survive the night. So, you could say that keeping the fire alive was an art form in itself. There was no flipping a switch. You didn't just throw a match on a pile of logs and let the flames roll. No. Starting a fire in the first place was a battle. You'd need flint and steel, patience, and a lot of luck. You'd probably have to dig around for dry kindling or twigs in a place where dampness ruled. Think soggy leaves and moisture from the cold that hung around like an unwanted guest. Once you had a spark, you'd nurture it with care, babying it like it was your last shot at making it through the night. And it wasn't just about getting the fire started. It was about keeping it going, day after day, night after freezing night. At night, things got especially tricky. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of just leaving the fire on and forgetting about it until morning. No central heating, no electric ignition, just you, your fire, and your sheer determination to keep the cold from swallowing you whole. As the temperature dropped and the wind howled outside, you'd have to keep an eye on those flames, tending to them throughout the night like a desperate guardian. If you let the fire go out, well, that was basically a death sentence. Letting that fire die down meant inviting the cold right into your home, into your bones, and it might as well be saying, "Welcome to your last night." So, what did peasants do when night came? They'd bank the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account, but rather in the oldest survival hack known to mankind. Banking meant carefully burying the glowing embers under a mound of ash, as though you were tucking your fire in for a long winter's nap. Think of it like wrapping your fire in a cozy blanket made of ash. Except it wasn't just for comfort. Ash, surprisingly enough, acted as a form of insulation, trapping enough heat to keep the embers smouldering through the night without going out completely. This meant that in the morning, you didn't have to face the terror of starting from scratch. You didn't have to go out and chop more wood or hope the fire gods were on your side that day. If you did it right, and it wasn't a damp, wet night, because let's face it, that's a whole different kind of nightmare, the fire would wake up from its little ash blanket nap. It would be smouldering softly, just enough to allow you to nurse it back to life with a little kindling or dried twigs. You'd add a bit of fuel, blow gently, and watch as the glow began to return, fighting the cold in the dim morning light. It was like coaxing a faint heartbeat to return to life, one slow breath at a time. A little fanning, a little stirring, and suddenly you were back in business. It was your one shot at staying warm, especially when the outside world seemed more like a frozen wasteland than a place you wanted to venture into. But, oh, if you didn't get it quite right, well, that was a different story altogether. If you were too tired, or maybe a little too careless, or perhaps the ash wasn't packed well enough, the next morning would greet you with nothing but a pile of cold ashes, a big old pile of failure. And in those days, failure meant frigid misery. You'd wake up to the realization that the fire you'd carefully tended to through the night was now nothing more than a dream, and you were left shivering in the morning chill. To make matters worse, you would have to face the frigid outside world, bundled in every piece of wool you could find, and go searching for more firewood, in the cold, in the snow, in a world where every step seemed to freeze your toes to the ground. It wasn't just about the cold. It was about the fight for survival, the understanding that without that fire, the night could very well be your last. If you couldn't get the fire started again, you'd have to rely on a little bit of luck, or maybe a bit of magic in the form of a spark, hoping that the old flint and steel would work its magic in the freezing cold. If the morning's fireless reality didn't break your spirit, it surely tested your patience. But hey, in the medieval world, the hearth wasn't just a source of warmth, it was a lifeline, a matter of life and death. It was the one thing that stood between you and being swallowed whole by winter. When your whole world was built around survival, everything hinged on that flickering flame. If it went out, you were back at square one, and no one wanted to go back to that place. And, if you really wanted to get fancy, you could also sleep by the hearth. Yes, that's right. Every night, the most coveted spot in a peasant's home wasn't the softest bed or the most luxurious corner. It was the space closest to the fire. This is where the family would gather, cramming together like a human lasagna. Kids, parents and grandparents, all huddling for warmth, praying the fire wouldn't give out. If you were lucky, you might even get a nice warm side while you slept. But if you were unlucky, you'd find yourself facing the fire, half scorched from the heat, while the other half of your body turned into frozen stone from the cold. That's medieval luxury, my friend. But the hearth wasn't just about survival, it also played a role in the social life of a medieval peasant. This wasn't just the place where you cooked your meals or tried to stay warm. It was the center of your world. The fire lit your evenings, giving you a place to gather and share stories, gossip, or just sit in silent solidarity with your family. It was where you'd sit, maybe mending clothes, or in the case of some peasants, carving out new tools or weapons for the next day's work. The fire was life, and at the center of every peasant home, it was their only ally in the face of relentless winter. But you know what? The fire didn't always act like a faithful friend. Sometimes, despite your best efforts, the wind would blow too hard, the wood would be too damp, or you'd run out of kindling, and suddenly, you're sitting in a freezing cold room, staring at the dark, empty hearth. Panic sets in. You can't just call the fire department, because that wasn't a thing, obviously. And you certainly can't just pull out your phone and search how to restart a medieval hearth. Instead, you had to rely on your survival instincts, your creativity, and maybe a little bit of luck. You'd end up making do with whatever you had. Maybe you'd grab some dried animal dung to try and stoke the fire back up, or you'd huddle under a pile of blankets with your family, hoping you could survive the night until the fire came back. But in the end, the hearth was your lifeline. A fire isn't just warmth, it's your last hope when the snow is howling at your door. Without it, you might as well be sitting in the middle of an ice storm, hoping for a miracle. And the best part? Peasants got really good at keeping the fire alive. So good, in fact, that they turned fire tending into an art, something that was passed down from generation to generation. The little tricks, the methods, the secret ways of keeping that fire burning, they knew it all. If you were a medieval peasant and you didn't have a good fire, well, That was a very big problem. And if you were lucky enough to keep that fire going all night, you had one more shot at making it through another winter. So, before you complain about the price of heating your home or how your furnace is acting up, just remember, keeping that fire alive was the difference between life and death in the medieval world. And while we're at it, if you're enjoying the story of how the humble hearth could be a matter of survival, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of medieval ingenuity. And hey, drop a comment below. How would you survive medieval winter? Would you be the one keeping the fire alive? Or would you be buried under a pile of straw, hoping for a miracle? Let's hear it. But what happens when the fire goes out? Without a flame to keep you warm, survival was at risk. In the next section, we'll explore how firebanking became a matter of life and death, and how it required every member of the family to take part in the fight against the cold. When it came to surviving a medieval winter, few things were more important than keeping the fire alive. It wasn't just a tool for warmth, it was the heartbeat of the home, the one thing separating you from the brutal cold outside. But once the night settled in, and the family huddled together in the dim glow of the hearth, what would happen to that fire? How could it survive the night without burning out completely? This is where the art of firebanking came into play. Firebanking was an art form, passed down through generations, like an ancient ritual. It wasn't just a casual act of piling ash on the fire, it was a survival tactic. Peasants knew that if they were to survive, they had to preserve the embers overnight, keeping them just alive enough to be brought back to life in the morning. You might not have had much, but you had to make the most of what you did have. Every ember counted. So, what exactly was firebanking? Well, after a long day of labour, as the night began to fall and everyone gathered around the hearth to rest, the fire didn't just go out. Instead, the family would carefully bank the fire by gently covering the embers with a thick layer of ash, like a protective blanket. The idea was simple. Keep the coals warm enough so that they didn't die out completely by morning. Ash acted as an insulator, trapping the heat and keeping the coals alive just enough to be revived when needed. You had to make sure it was done just right. Too little ash, and the fire would die. Too much, and you'd smother the embers. It was a delicate balance. Peasants weren't born with firebanking skills. They learned them over time, from their parents and grandparents. It wasn't something you could just pick up. It was a learned survival skill, a technique that required patience, care, and a little bit of luck. Families became fire guardians, each member playing a role in the preservation of that precious heat. Children learned early how to tend to the fire, and by the time they were old enough to contribute, they could bank the fire like seasoned pros. This wasn't just a skill, it was part of the family's survival strategy. If you didn't bank the fire right, you could easily find yourself shivering through the night, exposed to the cold with no real warmth to speak of. But it wasn't just about getting the fire to survive. It was about making sure it could be revived the next day. You couldn't afford to have the fire go out completely, especially when the rest of the day was spent gathering wood or fighting off the cold. If you banked the fire well, all you needed in the morning was a little bit of kindling, maybe a few twigs, and a lot of determination. The family would wake, groggy from a night of cramped sleeping arrangements, and one of the oldest children, or the most resilient family member, would rush over to the hearth. They'd clear the ash away, gently poke the embers to bring them back to life, and slowly add a bit of kindling. The process was slow at first, but if done right, soon enough you'd have a full-blown fire again, one that could warm your frozen fingers and get you ready to face the new day. The strategic placement of family members around the fire was absolutely crucial. At night, when the temperatures dropped and the bitter cold threatened to consume everything, the fire became the central point of warmth for the entire household. It wasn't a time for luxury or comfort, it was a time for survival. The hearth wasn't just a cozy fixture in the home, it was a lifeline. Without it, the cold would sweep in, unstoppable and unforgiving. So the family would gather closely around the fire, with everyone positioning themselves near its warmth, as close as possible, without literally sitting in the flames. The older members of the family, who were the most vulnerable to the cold due to their age, frailty, and slower circulation, would be placed closer to the flames, right next to the hearth where the heat was most concentrated. Their bodies, weakened by years of hard labor or sickness, were much less capable of fighting off the chill. If they weren't near the fire, they risked succumbing to hypothermia or frostbite. In the harsh, freezing medieval winter, it wasn't just about comfort, it was about staying alive. These older members would often lie down or sit, barely able to move, their bodies tucked into layers of woolen cloaks, hoping the heat would soak into their bones. Their position near the fire wasn't just a practical choice, it was a symbol of care and respect. The younger family members took on the responsibility of protecting them from the cold, making sure they had the best chance of surviving the night. The children, being more resilient, but still not as tough as the adults, would huddle near the edges of the group. They were squeezed between the adults and the fire, just close enough to feel the warmth, but not so close as to take the prime spots. They were young and vibrant, and their bodies could handle the cold better than their elders, but that didn't mean they were immune to it. Children were often the most vulnerable to frostbite and hypothermia, especially when they couldn't be kept warm enough during the long, freezing nights. They would try to stay pressed together with the other children, sometimes even wrapping their little bodies in extra layers of whatever ragged blankets they could find, all the while listening to the howling wind outside. It wasn't the comfortable sleep of a modern-day child in a cozy room with a heated blanket. No, this was survival sleep, a sleep full of shivering, and the cold that would inevitably sneak its way under every covering. And then there were the adults, the ones tasked with keeping the family alive and moving forward through another brutal night. They'd position themselves in such a way as to maintain a balance between warmth and practicality. Some would take the center positions, directly across from the hearth, so that they could feed the fire when necessary, or adjust the wood as it burned down. Others would stand at the edges of the family circle, keeping an eye out for any gaps where the cold might creep in. Mothers would often end up near the hearth, wrapped tightly in whatever they had, cradling infants, or helping older family members. Fathers, more often than not, would be the ones who made sure the fire never went out. They'd add the wood, carefully maintaining the flames, while also ensuring the family was positioned correctly to maximize heat distribution. They were the guardians of the warmth, not just because they had the physical strength to do so, but because they understood the importance of the fire as a life-giving force. Without it, all the layers of clothing, all the tightly packed bodies, wouldn't matter. It wasn't just about where people slept, though. It was also about the role each person played. As the night wore on and the cold crept in, some family members would take turns being fire watchers, maintaining vigilance over the embers, keeping them alive. If the fire went out, the consequences were dire. And so, the family members, in a sort of unspoken understanding, would take turns checking the hearth, ensuring that the embers didn't fade. Firebanking was a matter of trust. It was about relying on each other to ensure that the fire would be there when needed most. Every ember was carefully watched, and if the banked fire went out, it was a reminder of how fragile their existence was. But if the fire burned through the night, it was the sign of a family that had won another battle against the harsh winter, another night where they could rest easy, knowing that warmth was just a few embers away. And when morning came? Well, you could only hope that the fire would take kindly to the poking and prodding, that it would roar back to life, strong and bright. It was the difference between a cold start to the day, scavenging for more wood, and being able to warm your bones before venturing out into the freezing world again. The fire wasn't just about comfort, it was about keeping death at bay. Firebanking also had its share of risk. If you didn't bank the fire correctly, you could end up with nothing but cold, empty ashes in the morning, forcing you to brave the icy cold to gather more fuel, which meant wasting energy and time. Sometimes, Even if you banked it perfectly, the fire would go out anyway because of the harsh conditions, whether it was damp air, frost, or the wind that seemed determined to break through your defences. And then there were the nights when you couldn't bank the fire properly, perhaps because you were exhausted from a long day, or simply because you ran out of ash to smother it with. Those were the nights when you prayed that somehow the cold wouldn't completely steal your warmth before you could get it back. So, fire banking was essential. It wasn't just a method of saving fuel. It was a matter of life and death, of keeping warmth where it was needed most, for the family and the fire. And if you thought about it, you could almost see how these families passed down this method, like a family heirloom, from one generation to the next, making sure the next child would grow up with the same fire knowledge that helped their ancestors survive. Fire banking wasn't just survival. It was about passing down knowledge and making it through together. And hey, speaking of family survival tactics, if you've been enjoying this deep dive into fire banking, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss more fascinating medieval survival skills. Drop a comment and share. How would you have handled a fire in medieval times? Would you have been the one to make sure the fire survived? Or would you have been the one huddled close to the warmth, just trying to survive another freezing night? Let me know. But survival wasn't just about guarding the fire. It was also about how you slept. Let's talk about how peasants used the warmth of body heat to get through the coldest nights, and how sharing space with livestock became the key to staying alive. When it comes to surviving a medieval winter, the phrase, "dress warmly," doesn't quite cover it. Peasants didn't have the luxury of cozy fleece jackets, puffy coats, or the sleek, stylish insulation we wear today. No, in the medieval world, fashion was all about survival. If you wanted to stay alive, you didn't need to look good. You needed to layer up. And not just a little layering to the point of suffocation. You see, medieval peasants were walking layers of wool, fur, and whatever scraps they could find. If you think layering clothes is uncomfortable now, imagine being wrapped in itchy wool and animal skins that haven't seen a wash in months. Sounds like a party, right? First off, let's talk about wool, the medieval miracle fabric. Wool was the go-to fabric for peasants, and for good reason. It was durable, warm, and could take a beating. But here's the kicker. It was also itchy. Seriously itchy. Imagine wearing a scratchy wool tunic all day, every day, and then adding on some wool leggings for good measure. The best part? They didn't even have the luxury of modern detergents, so after a couple of months, those wool layers smelled like wet dog and stale sweat. Now that's a fashion statement. But wool wasn't the only item in the medieval peasant's wardrobe arsenal. For those lucky enough to get their hands on some animal furs, layering was taken to a whole new level. You see, animal skins were often used as outerwear in medieval times, especially during the winter months. Peasants would drape themselves in whatever furs they could get, whether it was goat, sheep, or even rabbit. And while that might sound cozy at first, you had to remember, these furs didn't exactly come with a fancy lining or a fluffy interior. Oh no, they were raw, tough, and smelly, and had about as much comfort as a bad night at a flea market. Still, if you were lucky enough to get a fur cloak, you'd wrap it around yourself like it was your only shot at survival. Now, to be fair, the layering process wasn't just about adding as much fabric as possible and hoping for the best. There was a certain art to it. Peasants would layer tunics, cloaks, and skirts on top of one another, each layer intended to provide another defensive shield against the cold. You had your undertunic, scratchy wool of course, followed by a thicker outer tunic made of a coarser wool. If you were really lucky, you might even get your hands on a padded vest, which was like the medieval version of a thermal underwear layer, not the most comfortable, but effective in trapping body heat. The more layers you had, the better. Some peasants would add multiple cloaks, not for style, mind you, but to maximize warmth. And these cloaks weren't your modern-day, stylish woolen capes. Oh no, these were heavy, cumbersome, and draped over the body like a woolen sack. The fabric was rough, sometimes infused with animal grease to help keep out the wind. It wasn't fashion-forward, but it was effective in keeping the cold out. If you've ever tried wearing a heavy wool cloak in a drafty house, you'll get the idea. It was warm, but not comfortable. The medieval version of layering for warmth was like being wrapped in every blanket in the house, except nothing was soft. Let's not forget the feet. The humble medieval peasant didn't have the luxury of high-tech winter boots. Instead, they'd wrap their feet in ragged strips of cloth, or layer up with woolen socks. These socks were like modern-day sweaters for your feet, warm, but not very breathable, which meant sweaty feet were pretty much guaranteed. And to top it off, the footwear wasn't exactly waterproof. Most peasants wore leather shoes or wooden clogs, and on cold, wet days, these would get soaked, turning the insides of their shoes into miniature swamps. So you could say that medieval peasants had a deep connection with wet socks and freezing toes. They were basically living, walking ice cubes. But hey, when you don't have many options, you make do. Now, if you think this sounds like enough clothing to keep the cold at bay, think again. Layering wasn't just about throwing on as many tunics and cloaks as you could find. It was also about the strategic use of materials. While wool was the fabric of choice for warmth, animal furs, leather, and even sheepskin were used to reinforce the outer layers. These materials could block the wind and provide a little extra insulation. But again, the trick was in how they were layered. Peasants were essentially creating a human version of a brick wall, with wool being the bricks and furs acting as the mortar. Head coverings were also essential in the medieval winter survival wardrobe. Peasants would often wrap their heads in woolen caps, shawls, or animal skin hoods to keep warmth from escaping. You might think you could do without a hat, but in the dead of winter, heat escapes from the head, so no one was walking around without some sort of head covering. Imagine wearing a wet, smelly woolen cap on your head all day, getting it soaked in snow, and then having to sleep with it on at night. Sounds cozy, right? But that's how they survived. If they didn't wear it, they'd wake up with frost-covered hair and a brain freeze that would last all day. But let's not sugarcoat it. The medieval peasant wardrobe wasn't just uncomfortable, it was downright brutal. There was nothing fashionable about wearing a damp, musty wool cloak that hadn't seen a wash in months. In fact, the smell alone was probably enough to knock out a few birds flying overhead. Imagine wearing a garment that carried the scent of old sheep, mixed with a bit of wet dog, and perhaps a hint of smoke from the fire. The wool, once fluffy and warm, had long lost any trace of softness, and had morphed into a stiff, scratchy mass of fabric that clung to you like a second skin, adding weight and discomfort with every movement. You know how your favourite sweater gets itchy after you wear it too long? Now, imagine that feeling all over your body, but times 1,000. And if it rained or snowed, well, that just added to the misery. The wool wasn't exactly water-resistant. No fancy Gore-Tex here. When the elements hit, wet wool was like a cold, clammy vice around your body. It clung to your skin, and instead of trapping warmth, it acted like a heat sponge, draining your body heat and turning you into a human ice cube. The wet wool would get heavier and colder with each passing hour. It was like being wrapped in a wet blanket, except that blanket didn't have the decency to dry out. It just stayed damp and miserable, sticking to you like a second skin. Your clothes, which were supposed to protect you, instead turned into a soggy prison, making the already unbearable cold even worse. Picture trying to sleep through the night with your body shivering in layers of soggy, itchy wool, with every breath turning to fog in the cold air. Comfort? Forget it. But the real kicker? These layers didn't come off easily. Peasants didn't have a change of clothes every day, or even every week. The same damp, smelly wool cloak would stay with them, day in and day out, until the snow melted and the warmth of spring finally started to break the freeze. Drying them out wasn't much of an option either. Without a fireplace for proper airing or heat, the damp wool would often stay that way for days, maybe even weeks, holding on to every ounce of moisture from the wet weather. If you ever tried to wear clothes soaked from rain, and then went to bed without any heat source, you might get a small taste of what medieval peasants went through. But that's not even the worst part. The more the wool dampened, the more it lost its original insulating properties. Instead of keeping warmth in, it was now just miserable and cold. Layer after layer of wet wool, drenched by the elements, created a vicious cycle. But you didn't have much of a choice. The wind would howl, the snow would pile up against the walls, and those layers of wool and fur were the only thing standing between you and the freezing hell outside. So, the soggy, smelly layers were worn for survival. In the grand scheme of things, a little discomfort from your wool cloak was nothing compared to the danger of freezing to death in the night. The fact was, peasants weren't worried about looking good or feeling comfy. They were fighting to survive. It might not have been comfortable, and it sure as hell wasn't luxurious, but those layers of wool and fur worked. They provided the bare minimum protection from the elements, and when layering for warmth, there was no room for complaining. The wind was howling at the door, the snow was piling up, and the cold was creeping in from every possible opening in your hut. That thick, itchy wool cloak was probably the only barrier between you and hypothermia. So, imagine yourself in the medieval world. You're wrapped up in layers upon layers of heavy wool, animal skins, and leather, trying to stay warm while the snow swirls around you, and the howling wind feels like it's tearing right through you. It's miserable, sure, but it works. It's not about comfort. It's not about looking good. It's about making sure you survive. And hey, when the temperature outside is low enough to make your breath freeze, the itchy wool and dampness suddenly feel a lot more like a necessary evil than a horrible curse. So, next time you're complaining about your puffy winter coat or your itchy wool sweater, just remember, at least you're not wearing wet, smelly animal pelts while trying to keep warm. You've got it easy compared to the medieval peasants who braved the coldest winters in history, all while looking like walking woolen monsters. And if you're enjoying these stories of survival, don't forget to subscribe for more. Have you ever had to layer up for warmth in a way that felt extreme? Maybe for a camping trip, or even just a snowstorm? Share your experience in the comments. Once you're bundled up, there's still the issue of the ground beneath you. So, how did peasants fight the frozen earth creeping up from below? Let's look at how they tried to insulate themselves from the cold seeping up through the floors. When it came to surviving medieval winters, the concept of personal space was, well, pretty much non-existent. There was simply no room for comfort or privacy when the temperature outside could freeze the life out of you. If you were a medieval peasant, you quickly learned that body heat was your most reliable form of warmth, and the more bodies you could fit into one cramped space, the better. If you've ever had a sleepover with too many people squeezed into a tiny room, imagine that experience. But now replace the soft blankets with itchy wool and frozen toes, and add a little goat for company. At night, when the cold settled in, peasant families would gather together like sardines in a tin. Huddling for warmth wasn't just a strategy, it was the strategy. The goal wasn't to sleep comfortably, it was to wake up in the morning with your fingers still attached. So, family members, from parents to children, would pile into the smallest space in the house, trying to huddle together for warmth like some sort of human lasagna. If you were lucky enough, you might get the middle spot in the pile, where the warmth radiated from all sides. But if you were unlucky, you were stuck on the edge, which was basically the medieval version of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And in case the human warmth wasn't enough, the medieval peasant household crew had a few other special guests: the livestock. Yes, you heard me right. Cows, goats, pigs, and chickens weren't just for breakfast or ploughing the fields. They were lifelines in the battle against the cold. When the night came, these animals weren't left outside in the freezing cold. They were invited inside to sleep right next to you. It wasn't exactly luxurious, but a goat's body heat was worth more than a goose-down pillow when you were fighting hypothermia. Imagine this: you and your entire family, cloaked in layers of wool and fur, shivering, trying to stay warm by curling up together in a big, tight bundle. And then, a pig, with its squeals, snorts, and whatever else pigs do, settles itself in next to you, perhaps nestled on the edge of your bed, sharing your blanket, and probably breathing a little too heavily. But hey, in that freezing world, that pig wasn't just a noisy nuisance. It was a warm, squishy radiator that might just save your life. You didn't have comfort or peaceful nights. You had warmth in the form of farm animals, and in that moment, a pig was a gift. And goats, they had their own special place in the medieval survival equation. These beastly little creatures would often be found next to the family members, not just for their body heat, but also for their unpredictable personalities. Goats, always ready to jump onto anything, might take it upon themselves to find a nice spot right in the middle of your bedding, whether you wanted them there or not. And if you were really lucky, the goat would snuggle close, providing some much-needed warmth in the dead of winter, while the rest of the family slept like a living quilt. You might wonder, why the heck would peasants bring animals into their homes in the first place? The answer is simple. Desperate times call for desperate measures. The livestock provided not just warmth, but security. If a cow was close to you, it was a little less likely to be stolen by thieving neighbours who might have had similar ideas about the winter chill. Plus, the warmth of the animals helped create a bit of a buffer from the cold stone or dirt floors, which were usually as uninviting as a frozen lake. But let's talk about body heat for a second, because there's no such thing as personal space when you're fighting frostbite. In medieval peasant homes, you didn't just share blankets with the humans you were related to, you shared your entire body. You slept close enough to one another that your breathing and the heat you radiated would keep your fellow peasants alive through the long, freezing nights. There were no silent, isolated nights in these homes. Everyone was in it together, pressing up against each other, shifting throughout the night like a human chain of warmth, fighting the cold as best they could. If you've ever had a family sleeping bag experience, you get the idea. Except the sleeping bag was your own body, and everyone else was just as squished in as you were. And if you were the unlucky one on the edge, that cold draft wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. So you did your best to stick close to the warmth, and trust me, personal space was the least of your concerns. Of course, there were downsides to this cozy situation. Let's talk about the smells. Because sweaty humans, wet wool, and livestock, all packed into one room, don't exactly create an aromatic experience you'd want to bottle up and sell. Imagine the overpowering musk of damp woolen tunics, that wet dog smell that clung to every piece of clothing. Then throw in the smell of goat fur, rough, pungent, and probably a bit more goaty than you'd ever want to experience. If the goat was close enough, you might even get a few stray hairs stuck to your face, adding insult to injury. Now, add to that the pig. Yes, the pig, the lovable creature whose very presence makes a house feel just a little more lively. Picture it, a pig, happily snorting and shuffling next to you, possibly digging its hooves into the straw bedding and sending up a mini cloud of dust and piggy sweat. The smell of pigsty is no joke, and when it's confined to a tiny room with people trying to sleep, it could knock the wind out of you. If you're lucky, you might get the gentle, sweaty warmth of a pig nestled next to you. But you're also getting that distinct, earthy scent that's a little too close for comfort. And then, of course, there's the cow. Picture a large, bovine creature curled up on its side, chewing its cud and occasionally letting out a low, wet moo. As if the pig and goat weren't enough, the cow's breath, a mix of alfalfa and warm milk, would hover over your head, and the smell of manure wasn't far behind. The cow's dense, musky coat probably didn't help either, as it mixed with the sweat of the humans, creating a thick, cloying atmosphere that would stay trapped in the air until morning. Every breath you took was a deep inhale of competing odors, and trust me, none of them were pleasant. The overwhelming aroma of the barnyard, combined with the heavy wet wool clinging to your skin, could make your head spin. Now, let's talk about the claustrophobia that came with all of this. Not only were you physically packed in tight, surrounded by family and animals, but the smell would hang in the air like an uninvited guest, too dense to escape. It was a swirling cocktail of sweat, animal musk, damp straw, and smoke, all settling into every corner of the room, making it feel like you were living in a never-ending sauna, except with the added joy of trying to stay warm through the numbing cold. If you tried to sleep, your nose would twitch with the smell of wet wool, and every gust of air carried the scent of whatever animal was closest to you. And if you were really unlucky, you'd get to experience the mixture of smells in the most intimate of places, your bed. Think about this. Your sack of straw would be shared with a pig or a goat, and maybe even a chicken or two, who would undoubtedly drop little presents in the middle of the night. Between the wetness, the sweat, and the undeniably potent smell of farm life, you quickly realized that comfort was optional, but survival was key. The price of survival was simply dealing with the smell, and let's face it, after a few hours, you probably didn't even notice anymore. Despite the tight quarters and unpleasant aromas, there were still benefits to having your livestock close. Cows generated a great deal of heat, so much so that a cow's warm, gentle body could almost make up for the lack of proper insulation in the house. And while it wasn't exactly the luxury lifestyle we're used to today, having the cow by your side wasn't the worst thing in the world when the wind was howling outside and the snow was piling up against your hut. A cow, while a bit smelly, could actually save your life, as could a few chickens, and if you had pigs, well, they might even offer you some companionship as they snuggled up beside you. In the end, the medieval peasant survival strategies were all about resourcefulness. Whether it was relying on the warmth of your family or your animals, the night wasn't about luxury, it was about fighting to stay alive. And despite the cold, the discomfort, the smells, and the cramped conditions, these peasants managed to survive. They didn't have central heating, electric blankets, or even a single comfortable mattress. They had each other, their animals, and the will to stay alive. So, next time you're bundled up in your cozy winter clothes, with a warm fire and a cup of tea, remember, the medieval peasants didn't have any of that. Instead, they had each other and a goat. And you know what? That goat was probably a little more helpful than you think. Got a winter survival hack of your own? Or maybe a personal space nightmare you've lived through during the holidays? Share it in the comments. Let's talk about how far we've come. Don't forget to subscribe for more wild, wintry adventures through the past. Despite all these efforts to keep the cold at bay, the real struggle lay beneath them, the frozen ground itself. Now, let's dive into how peasants dealt with the silent enemy below, and how they came up with creative ways to sleep on the frozen earth. You think your cold floors are bad? Medieval peasants had to sleep directly on the frozen earth, and that's when the real battle began. Picture this. After spending the entire day battling against the bitter cold, trying to keep your fire alive, layer upon layer of wool scratching at your skin, your stomach growling in protest, and your body feeling like it might freeze from the inside out. Then, when the time finally comes to get some rest, you're not climbing into a cozy memory foam bed. Oh no, my friend. You are crawling into a pile of straw, hay, or dried rushes, which is essentially like hugging the cold, hard earth. And, as if the chill creeping in from the walls wasn't enough, there was one final enemy lurking below, the frozen ground itself. The ground, the very foundation of your home, wasn't just a place to rest your tired feet after a long day. It was a constant, silent threat that was always out to get you. Once winter set in, the earth under your humble abode became as cold as a stone. The chill wasn't content to stay beneath your feet either. It rose up, wrapping its icy fingers around your bones, attacking your body from below, like a sneaky bandit you couldn't see but could certainly feel. You could layer your clothes, build your fire, wrap yourself in your goat-smelling blankets, but the ground? That silent enemy would just wait until you tried to sleep, then creep up through the straw, your damp wool, and settle in like a persistent, ice-cold guest you couldn't ask to leave. The straw mattresses, or rather, whatever passed for a mattress in the medieval world, might have been good at keeping out a few bugs, but they were terrible at keeping out the cold. Straw, as useful as it was, would flatten under the pressure of your body, becoming soggy with the dampness from the cold and your own sweat. Not to mention, the wetness turned the straw into a breeding ground for all kinds of fun creatures like mould, mildew, and of course, the ever-present lice and fleas. But the biggest enemy was the ground, which just loved to suck the heat right out of you. You would be lying there, trying to sleep, but the cold beneath you was a constant, nagging reminder that no matter how many layers of wool you piled on, you would never be warm enough. So what did peasants do to fight the relentless cold creeping up from beneath them? The answer: they got creative. You think your warm, soft blankets are a blessing? Try sleeping with nothing but a layer of old straw between you and the frozen earth. Insulation, in the medieval sense, meant using whatever was available to stop the cold from eating you alive, and peasants had nothing if not resourcefulness. The first line of defence was often more straw, layering it thickly across the ground to form a sort of barrier between the freezing earth and your poor, shivering body. The idea was that the straw would trap a little warmth from the fire and the body heat of those huddling on top of it. It wasn't fancy, but it was something. Straw, with its fluffy, light texture, seemed like a decent option to keep the biting cold at bay. But like most medieval solutions, it came with its own set of issues. First off, straw flattened quickly under the weight of a human body. It wasn't like the modern mattresses that conform to your body. No, this was more of a temporary solution. You'd spread the straw out, but within a couple of hours, you'd find that your layer of protection had turned into a compressed mess. Straw is light, sure, but when it's under pressure, it collapses. Instead of creating a cushion of warmth, it transformed into a thin, uneven surface that did little to stave off the cold. And let's not forget the wetness. The ground beneath was soaked with moisture, and once that dampness started to seep up through the straw, the whole thing turned into a soggy pit of misery. Instead of insulating you, it just increased your discomfort. You'd lie there, shivering, trying to ignore the cold clamminess creeping through every inch of your body. The worst part? That wet straw often turned into a smelly, mouldy swamp of discomfort, stinking up the place and creating the perfect breeding ground for fleas, mould, and other delightful pests. But at least it wasn't freezing stone, right? That was the comforting thought that probably crossed their minds. The straw, despite its many drawbacks, was still better than the alternative. Imagine lying directly on the frozen earth. No cushion, no straw, just your body pressed against the icy ground. It was a battle just to survive the night, let alone get any rest. But with straw, at least you had something between you and the cold ground. And don't get me wrong, straw wasn't a complete waste. For a few hours, it might provide a tiny barrier from the ground's cold, and it was better than nothing at all. The problem was that the dampness, combined with the pressure of multiple bodies lying on it, caused it to flatten and lose its insulating properties faster than you could say, "Winter is here." It was like trying to sleep on a mattress made of wet hay. The moisture from the earth would seep up, and soon you were just shivering under a damp, musty cover. But medieval peasants weren't the type to give up easily. Despite the smelly, mouldy straw, despite the inconvenient dampness, they would continue to pile it higher, hoping that maybe this time it would work. They would layer the straw thicker, even stuffing it in between cracks in the walls, or lining the roof in the hope that it would trap the warmth from their fire. But again, the weather didn't care. No matter how thick the straw was, or how many layers of hay and rushes you threw at the problem, winter kept coming. The cold found a way, seeping in through the cracks and gaps that straw couldn't fill. Some peasants went a step further and used rushes or herbs. The rushes, once laid out in thick layers, were supposed to help insulate the ground and provide a slightly softer resting surface. But that wasn't exactly a luxury mattress. After all, rushes don't come with that fancy memory foam technology. Over time, the rushes wilted, flattened, and, like the straw, became a swampy mess. It wasn't the sweet-scented herbal arrangement you might imagine, more like a stale, damp, plant-based carpet that brought in a whole new ecosystem of bugs and mildew. But wait, it gets better. If you were really clever, or really desperate, you could use animal dung to insulate the ground. Yes, you read that right, dung. Before you scoff, hear me out. Peasants didn't just smear poop on their homes for fun. It was a strategic move, and it worked, serving as a medieval DIY insulator, helping to block the cold from seeping in through cracks. But it didn't stop there. Some peasants went so far as to create a layer of dried manure on the ground itself, creating a warm-ish barrier between them and the frozen earth. Of course, it didn't smell like roses, more like soggy farmyard, but when the alternative was freezing to death, a little stink was a small price to pay for warmth. Now, it wasn't all about improvisation. There were also attempts to build structures that could hold in some of the heat. The most effective way to insulate the ground was to add thicker layers of dirt and earth, often packed tightly down to trap the warmth from the fire inside. But again, this wasn't the solution we think of today. The floors were still dirt floors, often compacted into something that resembled a muddy marsh, and once the earth cooled, it was like lying on a stone slab with no way to escape the cold. Human ingenuity only goes so far when the temperature outside is trying to kill you. But no matter how thick the straw was, or how many layers of rushes and dung you piled up, the cold was relentless. The frozen earth seeped up through the cracks in the floor, through the hay mattress, and into your very bones. And by morning, well, you could always hope your fire banking technique had worked well enough to stave off the chill, but sometimes you woke up and still had to face the bitter cold and the task of gathering more wood just to stay warm. The thing is, peasants didn't just survive by luck, they survived by learning to adapt to their environment. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it worked. And though we might complain about a chilly draft or our cold floors today, it's hard to imagine what it would have been like to sleep with nothing between you and the cold earth, but a few layers of straw, a damp woolen tunic, and the will to survive. And survive they did, despite the harshest winters history could throw at them. If you think your cold floors are bad now, imagine sleeping on the frozen earth, in a home with no heating, no insulation, and only goat hair and mud between you and the deadly chill. What do you think was the hardest part of surviving medieval winters for peasants? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe. There's plenty more historical survival hacks coming your way. Despite all the challenges, the resilience and resourcefulness of these medieval peasants kept them alive through some of the coldest winters in history. But what did we learn from them? And how does it compare to the luxuries we have today? Let's wrap up this icy journey by reflecting on how their struggle shaped the warmth we now take for granted. As we wrap up our deep dive into the medieval winter survival tactics, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. These were the coldest, harshest winters in history, a time when even the most basic comforts, warmth, food, a dry place to sleep, were often out of reach for the average peasant. And yet, despite the relentless cold, the improvised insulation, and the constant battle against the elements, medieval peasants found a way to survive. Against all odds, they fought through the bitter winds, the frozen floors, and the chilly nights with nothing more than sheer grit, resourcefulness, and the most creative survival hacks you can imagine. When we think about how hard life must have been for them, layering up with itchy wool, sharing beds with livestock, sleeping on cold, damp straw, or banking the fire just to make sure they'd survive another night, it's impossible not to be in awe of their stubborn perseverance. We've gone through a lot of the horrors they had to endure, from the frostbite risk to the bitter cold creeping up from the ground. But even in the face of all that adversity, these peasants did what they had to do to stay alive. Creative solutions, like layering the straw, using animal dung for insulation, and learning how to bank the fire, may seem imperfect from our modern perspective. But in a world without central heating, without any of the luxuries we take for granted, they found ways to make do with what they had. They didn't just survive, they adapted, learned, and persevered. And really, that's the true heart of medieval peasant life. It wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. When you lived in a house made of mud and sticks, where the cold wind blew through every crack and the fire barely stayed alive, your imagination and ingenuity were your best friends. You didn't have luxuries, but you had resilience. So, what can we learn from these unsung heroes? When we look at the comforts of today, let's not forget the stubborn perseverance of those who fought for survival, one freezing night at a time. Heating bills? Well, medieval peasants would have traded their goat-smelling wool tunics for a heated blanket in a heartbeat. Can you imagine? No thermostats, no space heaters, no cozy radiators, just the crackling fire in the middle of the room, desperately trying to keep you from turning into an ice sculpture. The next time you grumble about your heating bill, take a second to imagine surviving those brutal winters, armed with nothing but your ingenuity, a pig, and a heap of soggy straw. A leaky window? Try living with a whole wall made of mud and straw, where the cold didn't just creep in. It danced through your home like an uninvited guest, nipping at your heels with every gust of wind. Imagine the wind howling through cracks so big, you might as well have been camping outside, only without the better view or the chance to build a fire. It's easy to get annoyed when you feel the chill creeping in from that one pesky window, but these peasants would have envied your draft-free existence. And let's not even talk about how modern mattresses compare to sleeping on a bed of damp straw with a pig for company. You know how it feels when you accidentally sleep on a lumpy pillow, or wake up with back pain from a less than comfortable position. Now imagine that, but with hard-packed dirt beneath you, wet straw on top of it, and a goat snuggling up next to you for warmth. The squealing, the shifting, and the fact that you had to share your bed with livestock? Luxury, right? Just thinking about that makes your cozy foam mattress look like a 5-star hotel. The next time you turn up the heat, make sure to take a moment to thank those brave peasants who paved the way for the cozy comforts we have today. If they could survive sleeping on frozen dirt, fighting the cold with nothing but straw, and sharing their homes with goats, pigs, and unwelcome drafts, surely we can survive the small annoyances of our modern winters. If they could get through that, we can survive whatever winter throws at us. But seriously, let's take a step back and think about how incredible their survival was. The winter of medieval life wasn't just a season. It was an annual test of endurance, a never-ending fight to make it to the next spring. They didn't have science, advanced tools, or even the luxuries of modern technology. They had their wits, a stubborn refusal to give up, and the unspoken knowledge that survival was the ultimate victory. It's easy for us to laugh and joke about the cold draft, or the chilly floors we sometimes complain about today. But we would do well to remember that the resilience that carried medieval peasants through those brutal winters laid the groundwork for everything we now take for granted. The comforts of our modern homes, our warm blankets, and our reliable central heating systems didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were built on the back of centuries of human struggle and survival. Those medieval peasants? They may have lived in rural huts, but their ingenuity and resourcefulness shaped the foundation for all modern living conditions. It's almost humbling, right? When you walk into your warm house, flip a switch, and feel the heat kick in, or snuggle up in a cozy plush blanket on a soft mattress, don't forget the centuries of innovation, ingenuity, and blood, sweat, and tears that got us here. Survival was once a matter of life or death, but now we have the luxury of a warm home to retreat to at the end of a long day. And for that, we owe a lot to the gritty survivors of medieval winters, who showed us what it truly means to adapt, endure, and thrive. Now, before we wrap up, I'd love to hear from you. How do you deal with the chillier days? Do you have any special tricks to stay warm? Or maybe you've got some great survival tips of your own to share? Let me know in the comments below. Next time you complain about a chilly draft, remember, at least your bed doesn't smell like a goat and your walls aren't held together with poop. It's hard not to feel a little grateful for the toasty warmth we enjoy today. Think about it for a second. When was the last time you had to bundle up like a medieval peasant, layering every piece of wool and fur you could find just to keep from freezing? When was the last time you went to bed with a pig nestled at your feet to keep you warm? Or had to bank your fire so carefully that if you messed it up, your night's sleep could be a frosty disaster? For medieval peasants, that was reality. Survival wasn't just about fighting off the cold. It was about staying alive long enough to get to the next spring. There were no cozy blankets or heating systems to retreat to at the end of the day. Their homes weren't palaces. They were tiny huts made of mud, straw, and dung. Not exactly the kind of place you'd imagine when you picture the perfect winter getaway. But somehow, through sheer determination and a healthy dose of ingenuity, they found ways to survive even the harshest winters. Now, let's be honest for a minute. Life was tough for medieval peasants. Freezing floors, drafty walls, wet wool cloaks, and sleepless nights battling the cold. They didn't get to curl up by a fireplace in a cushy armchair with a hot drink and a fluffy blanket. No, they had to work with what they had, and what they had wasn't much. It was a fight against the elements every single day. Hypothermia was a constant threat. Frostbite wasn't just a possibility. It was a real concern for anyone caught outside too long. But they did it, day in and day out, and somehow made it through to the next season. And that kind of resilience? It's not something we should take lightly. So, let's think about this for a second. How often do we take our modern comforts for granted? Central heating, soft beds, fluffy blankets, and the ability to crank up the thermostat to whatever temperature feels right. Heck, we can even get up in the middle of the night and grab a hot drink to warm up if we're feeling chilly. It's easy to complain about the cold snap or the occasional draft, but when you really think about it, we're living in an age of luxury compared to those medieval peasants. It's humbling, isn't it? The next time you feel like complaining about the weather, maybe remember that there was a time not so long ago when people would sleep next to animals just to survive. When straw beds were the height of comfort and frostbite was a real risk. The next time you turn on your heater or slip into a warm blanket, take a second to appreciate the luxuries we've got. Sure, we still get chilly floors now and then, but we don't have to sleep on a mound of wet straw, with goats at our feet and drafts howling through our homes. It's easy to forget. But the comforts we enjoy today didn't just happen by magic. They were built on the backs of those who fought to survive in harsh conditions, one freezing night at a time. Those medieval peasants were the original survivalists, the first ones to figure out how to stay warm in a world that didn't care if they froze to death. They didn't have electric blankets, heated floors, or even a decent roof over their heads. They had stubbornness, resourcefulness, and a healthy sense of humor. Because if you didn't laugh, you'd just cry, right? And maybe that's what we should take away from all this. Survival isn't always about having the best gear or the latest technology. Sometimes it's about making do with what you have, being creative, and doing whatever it takes to make it through another day. The peasants didn't have fancy tools or modern conveniences, but they had ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the will to survive. They turned straw, animal hides, and the warmth of a fire into tools for survival. They made do, and they survived. And let's not forget, their resilience and survival skills laid the groundwork for everything we now take for granted. If those peasants hadn't found ways to stay warm, adapt to the cold, and make it through those brutal winters, we wouldn't have the comforts we enjoy today. Central heating didn't just magically appear, It was built on the hard work and survival of people who learned how to beat the cold with what they had. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but it worked. Now, don't get me wrong, we've come a long way since then. Today we've got insulation, central heating, and all the other modern comforts that make winter feel a little less grueling. But there's something to be said for the stubbornness and resourcefulness of those medieval peasants. They didn't give up. They didn't let the cold defeat them. They kept fighting, one night at a time, and they survived. So the next time you're feeling a little chilly, or your heating bill gives you a bit of sticker shock, remember, those medieval peasants would have traded places with you in a heartbeat. They'd be thrilled with your warm blankets, your comfy bed, and your reliable heater. And if they could survive their brutal winters, then surely we can make it through whatever winter throws at us. Next time you hear the wind howling outside, or feel a little draft creeping through, take a moment to appreciate the warmth you've got. And give a nod to those peasants, the unsung heroes of winter survival, who paved the way for the comfort we now enjoy. After all, they didn't have the luxury of sleeping through a snowy night with the heat turned up, but they made it through, just the same. And in their honor, we can do the same, one cozy winter at a time. So, what's the takeaway from all this? When you wrap yourself in your snuggly blankets tonight, remember the medieval peasants who battled the cold for survival, who made ingenuity their armor, and who helped build the world that gives us comfort today. It wasn't pretty, but it worked, and for that, we owe them a great deal. Thanks for taking this chilly journey with me. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, share your winter survival tips, and join me next time as we dive into more of the stories from the past that make us appreciate the comforts of today.